Blue Honey Radio.
All right, welcome to Blue Honey Radio. I am Andrew, and this is episode number 3 of The Lost Interviews. As always, you can visit bluehoney.org for this episode's corresponding webpage. There you will find detailed information, images, web links, and all sorts of good stuff. If you enjoy these podcasts, you can show your support in several different ways. One of the best ways you can support this podcast is to make a pledge on patreon.com. You can pledge any amount you'd like per episode, even $1. You can easily find a link to my Patreon profile on bluehoney.org. Just follow the link to Blue Honey Radio and it'll be right there. Or you can go to patreon.com/bluehoney. And if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube or somewhere with links in the description, you'll probably see a link there as well. You can also support this podcast by visiting bluehoney.org and ordering a t-shirt, so be sure to check those out. Okay, let's get into some altered states with Dr. Dennis McKenna. Back in the late 1990s, I was a member of a couple of online groups with Terrence McKenna. I never met him in person, but I was lucky enough to exchange emails with him on several occasions, and he really helped set me on the path that I'm on today. It wasn't until after he passed away that I met his brother Dennis. Dr. Dennis McKenna is an ethnopharmacologist, author, teacher, and public speaker. He and I have been friends for quite some time. He was in one of my films, and he and I have both given talks at the same events. In 2008, I drove up to Canada to visit him, and we sat down and recorded this interview. Some of you have heard parts of this interview, but it was edited down quite a lot, so it's nice to be able to release the entire thing. I wanted to start things off with some basics, and then work our way deeper into the world of psychedelics and shamanism. So let's begin with a simple question. Just what is shamanism anyway?
What is shamanism? Well, shamanism is a lot of different things. Among other things, it's, the famous ethnologist Merciliade called it the archaic techniques of ecstasy. And it certainly is archaic in the sense that it's probably our oldest religion. But it's much more than a religion. It's actually a set of practices for achieving altered states of consciousness, whether with the use of drugs or the use of other kinds of techniques like ecstatic drumming and sometimes self-flagellation, or sometimes different types of physical stress. But the basic idea of shamanism is to achieve an altered state of consciousness, and not simply to have the experience. The shaman actually uses the altered state to access a transpersonal realm, a realm of spirits or supernatural forces, which can maybe allies of some kind, which he or she can manipulate, communicate with, obtain information from, to help the community or an individual. And it's all tied up with healing and medicine too. It harkens back to a time when things like psychotherapy and medicine and magic and religion and all of these things weren't even fully formed concepts. So the shaman kind of combines all of these roles of he's a priest and a doctor and a psychotherapist, and also often a poet and an artist and someone that gives expression to the cultural myth of the culture. So and I keep saying he, and that's it should be clear there are shamanesses as well, or women shaman. It's not a gender-specific kind of thing. But the figure of the shaman is a important spiritual figure in these non-traditional in these traditional societies, in these indigenous societies, respected and a little bit feared, because the shaman is the odd person. The shaman is the person who is in direct contact with the transpersonal and is kind of the interface for the culture and the rest of the people. He or she is the person that gets to actually dialogue and travel in these realms, and they often use psychotropic plants to do this. Not invariably, but quite often.
So one of the main tools used by the shaman to achieve these altered states are psychedelic plants or sacred plants. And some people get caught up on terminology because mushrooms aren't technically plants. So the word psychedelics gets used quite a bit. I like this word because I like its meaning, mind manifesting. It really hits the nail on the head. At least for me. Others prefer the term entheogen because this gives the experience some religious merit.
Well, an entheogen is a term for these sacred plants. A term that I prefer is shamanic plant or shamanic medicine, because it's a plant, a psychoactive plant, usually a psychedelic or a hallucinogen, that is used in one of these shamanic traditions, right? So it's appropriate to call it a shamanic medicine, although the very same plant and the very same substance could be not shamanic if you're not using it in a shamanic context. If you're using it recreationally or taking it in a rave or some other situation, it's not really a shamanic medicine anymore. It's still the same substance, but if you're talking about substances that are used specifically sort of in this shamanic context, then I like shamanic medicine. I have problems with the term entheogen, although I know that it's gotten more popular after Carl Ruck, who was a classicist, and Jonathan Ott and some other people proposed it as an alternative to hallucinogen. Entheogen means manifesting the God within, in theos, within and God. And that's fine, except they don't always do that, right? I mean, again, the effects of these drugs are so specific to set and setting that you can take the same substance, one person can have a mystical experience, so you could call it an entheogen. Another person, the same person on a different occasion, or another person could take the same substance and have a psychotic experience. So then you could call it a psychotomimetic, which is another one of these terms that used to be used, and the term hallucinogen is like more accepted in scientific literature, but that's also inaccurate because these things don't really cause hallucinations in the way that a psychologist understands that. A hallucination is when you see something and you don't really know if it's real or not. You see things on these visionary plants, no doubt about it, but you usually know that they're not real, that they're something, that's behind your eyelids or whatever. Now, at very high doses, you might have true hallucinations, where you're actually seeing something and you cannot determine whether it's real or not. But that's very rare for these substances. So the term hallucinogen is inaccurate. The term psychotomimetic is inaccurate. The term entheogen is, it all depends on circumstances. My personal preference is I like psychedelic, because even though the term carries all this cultural baggage, and everything's psychedelic, that's kind of something left over from the 60s. But in the strict sense, psychedelic means mind manifesting. And I like the term because it leaves it open. I mean, these substances certainly manifest the mind in some aspect, and we don't have any argument with that. But how they manifest it, depends on set and setting. And like these other terms, sort of are more specifically related to set and setting. And they also show how difficult it is to really linguistically kind of put this in a box, characterize what they do. Sometimes they're mystical, sometimes they're induce psychosis, sometimes they don't do much of anything at all, but they always manifest the mind in some way. So I like psychedelic if it could just be divorced from all the connotations that it's come to have in our culture.
One of the things that always seems to come up when I talk about psychedelics or any drugs is the potential for addiction. Dennis and I started to chat about this for a bit, and his point of view on becoming addicted to psychedelics was almost identical to mine.
That's the question?
Right.
Are these psychedelics or entheogens? Are they addictive? Right. Well, I mean, the answer to the first question, are these psychedelic substances addictive? The answer is definitely not. Addiction is a term that is easily misused. Addiction again means something specific in the context of physiology or pharmacology. An addictive substance is something that causes long-term changes in the body, and so that your body really needs it after a while, and you don't work right if you don't get it. Something like heroin, for example. But it's often applied to things that we consume basically because we like them. I mean, I freely admit I'm addicted to coffee. I'm addicted to chocolate. But if I quit those substances, I don't have, well, in the case of coffee, maybe an exception. Maybe it truly is addicting, but we have to be careful how we use these words, right? I mean, preference is not addiction, but in terms of creating a craving, that you feel a compulsion to keep consuming the substance, psychedelics are, if anything, anti-addictive in the sense that, the experiences that they produce are often so profound and so sort of, difficult to integrate, unsettling, I guess. A lot of people, it's rare that people rush to repeat it, over and over again regularly. It's not that you have a craving to take the drug. You have a curiosity about the experience, and you often have to overcome your reluctance to take the drug in order to have that. You see this with ayahuasca very strongly. If you drink lots of ayahuasca, you actually develop a physiological aversion syndrome. And this is well known where with other substances where it tastes so bad and you get sick and all that, and you actually really don't want to consume it, but you do, and somehow you always get it down, and you're always glad you did, because you overcome the aversion and you learn so much from it, but it's definitely not addicting. Quite the opposite. Now, can it be used to overcome addiction? Yes, I think so. In again, this goes back to set and setting and how it's used, and what the intent is, right? In the right set and setting, with the right kind of psychotherapy support or religious support or whatever the context of the support is, and most importantly, what the person's intention is when they take it. If they're an addict or an alcoholic, they can take ayahuasca, they can take peyote, they can take these substances, and it will definitely help them to get over that. And in the case of something like ibogaine, it's even more specific. I mean, there's other things going on with ibogaine that might interrupt the addiction syndrome on the physical level. But the thing is, I've also known many people who take a lot of psychedelics and they're heroin addicts, they're alcoholics. It hasn't helped them a bit. So, honesty behooves me to say that. This is not a miracle cure for addiction. All these things can do is open up an opportunity for the person to examine their lives and resolve to change if that's what they want to do. But it won't compel them to change. It's not going to force anybody off drugs. It's like a lot of other techniques for treating addiction, talk therapy or whatever. They work in some people and not in other people. Now, if we look at the study we did on ayahuasca with the UDV, all of those people in our study were either drug addicts or alcoholics before they joined the UDV. And then they had some initial experiences that were quite terrifying or quite, I don't know if terrifying is the word, but more like quite opening for them. It forced them to kind of examine where they were going in their lives and where they were likely to end up. And then often, because it was in the context of a church, they had a revelation where they would see Christ, or they would see Master Gabriel, who was the founder of the cult, or they would see the Virgin Mary, or whatever their iconic figure was. And that figure would appear in the visions and say, well, you don't have to go down this path. You can take this other path. And they all did, and they all insisted that none of this would have happened, if they had just taken the drug. They all insisted that it was being in the church and being in this supportive environment. And of course, it is a church, so they go to great lengths to reinforce that idea, that you can't do it outside the church. So I think it can be used, but I think it's really just a tool. It's not a miracle cure for addiction.
We'll discuss ibogaine and treating addiction with the use of psychedelics in another episode, but for now I wanted to focus on other uses of these altered states. And I think the big question is, can these substances be used as a way to mentally prepare for death?
Yes. I think so, definitely. In fact, this really sort of crosses over into the shamanic use of these things. I mean, the shaman is a person who learns through discipline to navigate in these realms. And this is the realm of, he learns to pass through both ways, through the doors that the dead pass daily. I think that high doses of psychedelics or something like DMT is very close, probably. I mean, I've never had a near-death experience. I hope never to have one until I'm actually dying, But people who have had them say that they're very similar to high doses of DMT. And there's even reason to think that the DMT, which our own bodies make, may be involved in the near-death experience. That, in a state of stress on the mind and body that is produced when you're dying, it's not inconceivable that your brain releases a massive flood of DMT and you have this experience. So, yeah, I think shamanic navigation, or exploration with psychedelics is probably the best preparation for death that we have.
But if you ask most people, they'll tell you that religion is the best preparation for death that we have, and that the only thing that you need to take and eat is the Eucharist. But unless you trace the Eucharist back to its origin, It doesn't even compare to the psychedelic experience.
I mean, the difference is that the Christian Eucharist promises a lot and delivers very little in terms of, in other words, you have to believe to get much out of the Christian Eucharist. And if you believe, then you may get, you won't get a psychedelic experience, but you will get something, an affirmation of faith or a feeling that you're, in communication with the Creator. I mean, frankly, to be honest, I don't believe. I was raised Catholic, but it never made any sense to me, and so I don't believe, so I can't really tell you what a devout Christian gets from the Eucharist. What's different about psychedelics is they do deliver something. They deliver an experience if they're taken in the right set and setting. And I think one of the main things that sets them aside from, or that distinguishes them from the Eucharist is you don't have to believe. In fact, I tell people faith is not necessary, to experience what psychedelics have to teach. In fact, that's an impediment. Get rid of your faith. Approach it like a scientist, You don't have to believe. You can be as skeptical as you want. You can take the substance in, you can experience it, and you can make your own judgments what it's about. And you don't have to believe what the shaman is telling you, what the guru's telling you, what Dennis McKenna's telling you, what anybody's telling you. Ultimately, the value of the psychedelic experience, although I think it's important to have a context, whether that's shamanic or religious or psychotherapeutic or something you make up, it's important to have a vessel in which you allow this very special experience to unfold, but it can be a vessel, of your choosing. The ultimate value of it is, it's the confrontation of, you, the individual mind, and the experience, whatever that is. And you don't have to have faith, and you don't have to give up your physical your critical faculties. I mean, you can look at it. Some people will say, well, I was in touch with God, and other people may say, I was in a toxified brain state. Both interpretations are valid. It's all about what the individual makes of it. So that is one of the big differences. Now, I think historically it's very interesting that, when, as you well know, since you made this film, when the Spanish Inquisition got to the New World and they found these Aztecs, eating mushrooms and having a jolly old time and having these ecstatic experiences and all that. If that wasn't bad enough, but then they were calling it the flesh of the gods. Teonanacatl was the Aztec term for the mushrooms, which meant flesh of the gods. And this just enraged, the clerics. And they just, this was like so blasphemous, it couldn't be tolerated. And so they really, reacted more brutally than they might have otherwise reacted to try to suppress this thing, because they just couldn't have this kind of thing. The parallels were too striking, and their Eucharist didn't do much, and the Aztec Eucharist delivered big time. So that was another reason why it had to be suppressed. This gets into a whole other conversation, and we could go down many tangents in this respect, But when religions come in contact with a real mystery, with a really numinous thing, they don't like that, because numinous things are inherently dangerous and threatening, and a lot of religion has to do with controlling people. And, there needs to be a distance between God or the numinous archetype, whatever that is, and the people, and that's usually the priestly hierarchy and the infrastructure around that, and the sort of infrastructure that filters the message, and I'm not saying the Aztecs, I mean, they had this too, mushrooms were not handed out to everybody in Aztec culture. It was something the priests and the elite had access to. So I think I answered that question.
At this point, we took a break and we started discussing the most potent psychedelic substance known to exist, dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. And I knew how he would answer this, but I couldn't resist asking Dennis, where can this DMT be found in nature?
Where is DMT found in nature? Well, a better question would be, where is it not found in nature? I mean, this is really interesting to me. The fact that DMT is so ubiquitous in nature, and it is from the chemical standpoint, structurally, it's the simplest of the psychedelics. It's a very, very simple compound. And in terms of biochemistry, it's only 2 steps away from tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid. It's one of the essential amino acids, meaning we have to get it from our diet. That's why it's essential. We can't make it. Other things can make it, but humans, mammals can't make it. So they call it an essential amino acid. But tryptophan is one of the 20 amino acids that goes into proteins. So it is universal. All living things have tryptophan. Now, not all living things have DMT, probably, but the enzymes that convert tryptophan to DMT, there are 2 main enzymes in this process, are also universal. I mean, I don't know how chemical we want to get here, but the basic idea is there's an enzyme that takes off the acid group of the amino acid, so it turns it from an amino acid into an amine. And then there's another enzyme that puts methyl groups onto the amine. So first you get tryptophan, and then you get tryptamine, and then you get dimethyltryptamine, which is what DMT is. And this goes on, I think, very commonly. Well, these enzymes are certainly common. I mean, they're common in all cells practically. Do all organisms contain DMT? I think it's possible that all organisms might contain traces of DMT. There are many plants that contain DMT. We know of at least a couple hundred, and that's only because we've looked. There are probably thousands of plants. In fact, my suspicion is that because tryptophan is so easily converted to DMT, I think if you went out with a sufficiently sensitive instrument, mass spectrometer or whatever, and just started sampling plants at random and shoving those through your gas chromatograph or whatever you're using, you would find traces of DMT in every plant. And you would also find it, we know it's very widespread in animals too. So we know it's in amphibians, we know it's in mammals, including us. We know it's in marine organisms, we know it's in fish. So it's odd that, well, maybe it's not odd. It's just a fact of nature that it's all over the place. And probably is about as close to being universal as anything is. Although strictly speaking, it's not a universal compound, but it's unlike tryptophan, which is in every living thing, but it's probably all over the place. And it's strange that it should be the tryptamines that are so widespread, because the other important natural hallucinogen other chemical class, which is the phenethylamines, is mescaline. And mescaline, which is a pretty simple compound, but it only occurs in the cactus family. It has not been identified outside the cactus family. So that's kind of strange. Here you've got a comparably simple compound that only shows up in one family, and you've got DMT, which shows up everywhere in nature. Maybe nature's trying to tell us something. And I don't know what that is, but I mean, I can speculate, but maybe this is a sort of, this is not a scientific idea, this is a wacko philosophical idea, but maybe the ubiquity of DMT is signature of consciousness in nature, or nature sending a message to, the big brain stupid primates, wake up, look around, it's everywhere, mind is everywhere. So it's all over the place.
I think the fact that DMT can be found in virtually every living thing is astounding. That means that your brain, right now, is literally floating in the most potent psychedelic substance known to exist.
Yeah, DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT and even beta-carbolines, which are the other component of the ayahuasca combination, do occur in the human brain, and they occur in other places in the human body, in the adrenal glands, for instance, probably in the gut, but they definitely occur in the human brain, especially in the pineal gland. The pineal gland is very important for regulating sleep and our photoperiod and a lot of different things, sexual maturation. It works kind of in tandem with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has one action, and the pineal gland tends to balance that out. And the pineal gland, the main hormone, or one of the major hormones in the pineal gland, is melatonin. And melatonin is a tryptamine, and it's very closely related to DMT. Another pineal hormone that's important is a compound called pinealine, named after the pineal. And that is a beta-carboline. And the pineal also makes DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. And when it makes it, and what the function of those things are, is not completely understood. But a lot of work that Rick Strassman did on this, if you're familiar with his book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which he reported some of his findings. But he got interested in this initially because he was trying to be very scientific about it, and trying to answer the question from that standpoint. What is the function of a hallucinogen? What is it doing in the human brain, and does it have a function? And he didn't totally answer the question, but there are some speculations as to what it might do.
One of the things researchers have looked into is the connection between DMT and stress, and even the relationship between stress and altered states in general.
Yeah. Well, yes, stress of all types can induce these like transpersonal experiences, or near-death experiences. And it's not, DMT may be part of the basis of this stress reaction, but if you look at things like the ghost dance in Native American practice, where you're suspended from hooks and from a pole, that's got to be stressful, right? But people have these transcendent experience. I mean, and that's a shamanic thing. It's using stress to induce an altered state of consciousness. And flagellation and yoga and sweat lodges and all these techniques are basically to put the body in a state of stress. And when the body is stressed, a lot of things go on. I mean, you get your flight or fight reaction, essentially. You get pumped up and you get all kinds of hormones released. And it's not surprising that one of those might be DMT. DMT is found in the adrenals, for one thing. And the adrenals have a lot to do with modulating stress, right? You've got the corticotropic hormones, you've got adrenaline, which is now called epinephrine, which is one of the neurotransmitters that's released when you're in a state of essentially ready for anything, ready to flee or fight, or fuck. That's it's really 3 F's on this thing, But when you get in a state of arousal for whatever reason, and it's not surprising that DMT is part of this stress response. And it's hard to imagine a more intense state of stress than realizing that you're dying. So, and as the body starts to shut down, it wouldn't surprise me at all if DMT is released in massive quantities. It only makes sense. I guess it's something that's very hard to study scientifically. I mean, in a way, you can't really. I mean, you could, but it's difficult to approach a patient that way. Oh, I see you're dying. Do you mind if I take a few blood samples? Well, you're going through this. I mean, some would allow it, but it's difficult to get approval for that kind of thing. I mean, the other interesting thing about endogenous DMT is also at the beginning of life. When does it enter? When is it first synthesized? When does the pineal? And Strassman has something about that it happens on the 49th day after conception, which is very interesting because in Tibetan Buddhism, if I'm correct here, they say the soul enters the body, the reincarnating soul enters the new body on the 49th day after conception. So maybe DMT, the appearance of DMT in the sort of the neurochemical soup of the brain on the 49th day after conception, maybe that is some kind of demarcation point where, the soul enters the body at that time. I mean, I've often thought that people, they wouldn't like this, but if you wanted to say when does the soul exist? Is it at the moment of conception? I mean, when is it, or is it sometime after that? And maybe that's the demarcation point, and before that, there really is no soul in the body. And soul is another one of these sort of loaded words. What do we mean by the soul? I don't know.
I did interview Dr. Rick Strassman about this, so stay tuned for that. But Dennis and I continued talking psychedelics, and the topic of communication came up. Communication, as in, is it possible that these plants and mushrooms somehow communicate with us during this experience?
Well, yes, they do. They seem to. You have these experiences, and you seem to have a communication, right? And very often they present themselves as an intelligence, something outside yourself, and you're communicating with it. You're having a dialogue or some feeling of, an other that you're interacting with. Whether it is a illusion or not, it's hard to it's really hard to know. The sort of the reductionist explanation would be, well, it can't possibly be communicating with you. It's some other part of yourself, that's split off, and it is presenting itself as autonomous. But you can't really know. I mean, one of the games my brother liked to play with the mushrooms was, in this dialogue situation, he was always saying, tell me something I can't possibly know, right? And that will validate that it's not me, that this is coming from. I don't know that he ever succeeded in getting it. It's very cagey, they're very tricky that way. It's, but occasionally they do seem to tell people things that they can't possibly know, or that they've never thought about in quite that way. I mean, now it's come out, for example, that Crick's insight into the structure of DNA was assisted by LSD, and he reluctantly but finally admitted that was a big influence. And many computer scientists, Steve Jobs has said LSD's been very useful for his creativity. Kary Mullis, the Nobel Prize winner who figured out the PCR chain reaction, has been quite upfront about it and not reluctant at all. He said, LSD gave him the ability to get down with the molecules and see what's happening. And so, in some sense, I don't know. In some sense, there is a communication. In some sense, the question isn't even valid, because where do the boundaries between the self and the world exist? We're not really separate. I mean, we're part of this information field. And, this notion that consciousness, I do think that consciousness it's like a property of the continuum. It's like the old physicist concept of the ether or something. It kind of permeates everything. And it's not really localized in the human brain or necessarily even generated by the human brain, but it may be that the brain is a place where it becomes focused and concentrated. The brain may be as much a receiver of the signal as it is a generator of the signal. Nobody can really say, but that model in some ways appeals more to me than the notion that it's all coming from the brain. The brain is more like a node, and there's this sort of field of consciousness that permeates everything, and to a certain degree, everything is conscious. So I'm an animist in that sense, but I'm a 20th century or 21st century sort of Whiteheadian animist. Whitehead was Alfred North Whitehead had a very interesting understanding of the way the world was constructed. He said, everything is an organism. Everything is a process in a sense, and I think that's valid, So I forgot what we were talking about. Or reframe it. So when it comes to this communication thing, there does seem to be an element of communication and an element of talking to or being in communication with something that's not you, and whether that's an illusion or not is a much trickier question, because you get into areas of ontology and philosophy. In some sense, all of experience is an illusion. Everything that we experience in the here and now and our state of being is a hallucination, an elaborate hallucination that our brains construct. We happen to call it consensus reality. But it's still, physics tells us that, the picture of reality that we build so that we can navigate through the world and not step in front of buses and stuff like that and do all those. The world doesn't really look like this at all. The brain constructs a model of reality that more or less maps onto reality. It's good enough that we can survive. But if we change the nature, we have the model and we have the real world out here and we have the sensory neural interface that's taking this information in, interpreting it, and giving us the model. If we change the nature of the sensory neural interface a little or a lot, if we substitute, say, DMT for serotonin, the model of the world that we get changes radically. And who's to say that that's any less valid than the model that, the brain constructs for everyday purposes? So this idea that, it's all illusion, it's all hallucination. That's what experience is, That's why, in some ways, I sometimes get a little impatient with people that say, a drug experience cannot possibly have any spiritual validity. Well, I'm here to tell you that all experience is a drug experience. We're all on drugs all the time, largely because we're made of drugs, and that's what drives us. Experience is, sort of the what issues out of this biochemical process of, all these neurotransmitters and hormones moving around our brain. It's drugs. They are drugs.
But some drugs are different than others. Psychedelics, entheogens, sacred plants, call them what you will, but these fall under a unique category. Timothy Leary encouraged people to tune in, turn on, and drop out, and that really sums up the aftershock of a psychedelic experience. It can really change the way you see the world, and I bet anyone who's had an intense psychedelic experience would agree with that. As our conversation continued, we strayed onto the topic of how a society based on entheogens might be more difficult to market silly products and overpriced name-brand widgets to.
Well, I guess it depends on the widget, Yeah, you can sell hot tubs and iPods and things like that, but probably not, maybe fewer, motorcycles or SUVs or something like that. I don't know. I do think that psychedelics sort of make people aware of realms that are less material. That the real the really rewarding experiences are not necessarily what Wall Street or Madison Avenue or Hollywood wants to deliver to you. Those experiences, and they're synthetic experiences just as much as a drug experience is a synthetic experience, but they're usually tied with some consumerist, agenda. And this is part of the sort of the inconsistent attitude of society. They meaning, I don't know, the corporate hegemony or whatever. They want people to be addicted to things. They want people to consume things, and not necessarily to drugs, but drugs will do. They want people to drink and smoke and all these things, and they want people to be addicted to their cars and computers and TV and all that. So, a lot of what it's about is kind of keeping people entertained and focused on these sort of corporately massaged, corporately created versions of reality. So definitely I think the culture encourages that. And something like entheogens are inherently threatening to the culture. That's, I think, one reason that they're brutally suppressed, both when capitalist cultures or dominant cultures come on indigenous cultures. They're usually bringing another religion, an outside religion, Christianity or whatever, usually incompatible with the indigenous practices. So that's the first thing to go, and the first thing to be attacked. And along with that goes the knowledge of these plants, and that is, and in our culture, certainly there are bad drugs. Well, actually, I tell my students there's no such thing as a bad drug, right? Because a drug is just a drug. It's a substance with certain properties. It has no moral qualities. The only thing that has moral qualities is human behavior. And there is lots of bad human behavior with respect to drugs. And there's lots of bad human behavior with respect to all kinds of things, and good human behavior too. Again, this comes back to, the context. So the whole war on drugs idea and the idea, it has nothing to do with protecting people from toxic substances. If that were the purpose of the war on drugs, tobacco and alcohol, would be prohibited tomorrow. And yet the structure of the law, not that prohibition would do any good, and I'm not advocating that, right? But if that were really the agenda for drug control, they would say, well, these are clearly the most harmful drugs. These are the ones that are killing the most people, so they should be strictly regulated. But in fact, the way the law is set up, the FDA is not even allowed to classify tobacco and alcohol as a drug. So this makes no sense. So, okay, if the war on drugs is not about protecting people from harmful substances, what is it about? Why are all these substances illegal? Well, the obvious question to my mind is it's about the control of behavior. It's about control, and ultimately it's about control of what people can think, and it's the control of experience. It's essentially the state arrogating itself to the point where it says, certain states of consciousness are allowed and other states of consciousness are not allowed. And that's really what it comes down to. This is about cognitive liberty, in a sense. It's the state saying, don't go there, because if you take this entheogen or you take this psychedelic, you're going to have funny ideas. And funny ideas are very dangerous, especially if they don't fit in with, what we're saying should be, kind of the accepted cultural zeitgeist. So that's the danger of psychedelics, is they actually cause people to question the cultural paradigms and say, well, maybe this is not consistent with maybe the revelations of psychedelics are not consistent with what Hollywood and Wall Street and the government and Main Street and, religions and all these institutions are dishing out. What they all have in common, those institutions, obviously with rare exceptions, and there are always individual exceptions, but as institutions, what they have in common is they discourage individual thought, and they discourage critical thinking, and they discourage questioning. They encourage that, okay, here's a body of beliefs or cultural norms or, a largely accepted beliefs, and you're just supposed to accept it, Don't ask questions, sit down and shut up. Accept it and integrate it and be a good, citizen, consumer, whatever the role is decided. Entheogens are inherently threatening because they enable people, or sometimes they compel people to reject that, and say, well, maybe there's more to life than working in a cubicle for some faceless corporation so I can not have health insurance and die sick and, without a pension and, and just spend my time with that. Maybe it encourages people to, look for different purposes in life than that. And so that's really, I think, what's going on. And actually, that's the weakness, of what I'm sort of beginning to call the death culture, and these things then actually become, in a sense, our own bioweapons. Or if we're on the other side of this divide, then these plants, especially the plants, become very dangerous in this context. They're trying to suppress them, but you can't suppress them. And they're ways of changing hearts and minds. So they are definitely very, very dangerous. But they can be used in a creative way to counteract kind of the toxic message that the mainstream culture puts out.
Dennis briefly mentioned the death culture, and just about a month after this interview, I spent the weekend with him and we shot a little video on this topic. You can find that pretty easily. Just visit bluehoney.org and follow the link to my YouTube page. From there, just search my videos for death culture. At the time of this interview, I was doing a lot of research into the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and I wanted Dennis to give me his perspective on this mushroom because chemically, it's worlds apart from other psychedelics.
You already know I can talk about anything, but I can talk about it. I mean, Amanita is, it's really fascinating because I don't think anybody's quite understood all there is to understand about this. I mean, that could be said of any of these things, but, we know that it has this, it's the iconic mushroom, in a sense. I mean, it's the archetypal mushroom that goes way, way back to at least the Paleolithic. We know that Siberian shamanism is where the whole thing is thought to have originated, and that was a lot of that constellated around Amanita. And, the classic shamanic motifs of the ascending the world tree and having the axis mundi that links the celestial and the earthly and the underground realms. And in Siberian shamanism, this is often depicted as a mushroom. And, the whole idea of the flight of the soul and all that is associated with Siberian shamanism. And Siberian shamanism and Amanita use are intimately connected. So we know that connection goes way back. But the problem for me as a pharmacologist, and in some ways a reductionist, is that the pharmacology of Amanita has nothing to do with serotonin, at least the chemistry that we know. All of the true hallucinogens, the true psychedelics, like psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca, these sorts of things, they all work on the serotonin neurotransmitter systems, and they're very specific for these two subtypes of serotonin receptors, the serotonin 2A receptors especially, and to a certain extent the serotonin 1A receptors. And they all seem to have this in common, that these transpersonal psychedelics tweak these receptors. And that could almost be part of the definition of a true psychedelic, is it has to tweak these receptors. So then you've got something like the muscimol and ibotenic acid from Amanita muscaria, which works on a completely different set of neurotransmitters, the so-called GABA receptors, which are the same receptors that other things work on, like benzodiazepine type tranquilizers, for example, or like alcohol, or like kava kava. All of these things tweak the GABA receptors in some ways, and not always in the same way. The whole GABA receptor business is rather complicated. Well, it's all complicated, but GABA receptors are, they're associated with ion channels in the brain, and some things bind directly to the receptor and do things, and some other drugs bind to adjacent sites on the receptor and change their conformations and all that. And I don't want to get into all those details, but the bottom line is that muscimol, which is the active main psychoactive principle in Amanita muscaria, is a very potent GABA agonist. So it interacts specifically with these receptors, and not much, and not at all with the serotonin receptors, except possibly indirectly. So how can Amanita muscaria produce these transcendent experiences? And there are several possible answers. Maybe they don't. I personally am not familiar enough with Amanita muscaria to say that they do. My own experience with Amanita was very limited because I didn't enjoy it, but it didn't seem like a transcendent experience at all. It seemed like a cheap drunk in a way, but I dealt with, I was eating fresh mushrooms, and it's almost always taken dried. I think there's a great deal of chemical variation in the mushrooms, both geographically. There's geographic variation. The mushrooms in the Himalayas and in Siberia may not be the same as the ones in Colorado, just from a chemical angle. So there are many chemical races, of these mushrooms. Some of them may contain true psychedelics. Some of them may contain tryptamines and or beta-carbolines. There's some evidence that they do, these DMT and this kind of thing, do show up in some of these things, some of these amanitas. It's a complicated picture. Nobody has sorted out, somebody really needs to go through and do two things. They need to collect mushrooms very carefully from different parts of the world and do chemical profiles to see if they can define a chemical race, or are there certain races that are high in these tryptamines. Someone also needs to look at the way that they're prepared, because I think I've talked with people, and you have too probably, who insist that they are really very psychedelic, but you have to dry them a certain way, and they have to be dried over a fire. They have to be, and the fresh mushrooms don't get it, Now that's where this urine thing that you brought up in your previous film is very interesting to me, because I knew that they could they could drink urine, and you could go through about 5 cycles and all that. And I never really thought too much about it, but what your previous film really brought home to me was that this is very important. This may be the secret of Amanita, because it seems to me, from what you were saying, that it's not simply that it goes through. There's a filtering, and there's a detoxification process. So the first collection after you eat it has probably got a lot of things cleaned out of it that might make for an uncomfortable trip. It may also, this is pure speculation, but it's possible that some of the downstream effects of taking these GABA agonists, which is what the Amanita, it might induce the production of endogenous tryptamines, DMT plus beta-carbolines, so that the person who ate that urine or drank that urine after this process might be getting a lot of things that is not in the mushrooms, but it's actually secondary metabolites that are produced by the eating of the mushrooms. So you get the mushrooms, you eat the mushrooms, and you get all these feedback loops happening, and you get possibly things excreted in the urine, possibly these tryptamines and beta-carbolines. I don't know that this is possible, but it's completely reasonable to speculate. It's also testable. I mean, all of these things can be approached. All it takes is time and money, right? If you had the time and the skills and you had the money, you could test this and you could verify some of this stuff. The same with doing extensive surveys of the different populations of mushrooms. I think that could be very instructive. So from the personal point of view, I mean, my own personal experience with Amanita hasn't been something I want to really explore. I mean, it hasn't been that personally rewarding. But I haven't pursued it in a serious way. And I've talked to people who are quite serious about it, and they insist that it's really about how it's prepared. And this cycling it through the body may be a very important part of that. Most people, we also have a cultural bias about drinking urine, but there's really nothing wrong with it. And lots of cultures do it, and there are even people in our culture who do this as a health practice. They say that it's quite good for you. I don't know. I believe them, but I'm not likely to try it. But I might try it I might try it with the Amanita just to see, just from the empirical, point of view. I mean, a scientist has got to be willing to put their money where their mouth is, in a certain say. But I mean, Amanita remains a mystery. Just we don't understand that much from the chemical and pharmacological point of view. When it comes to the strict psychedelics, the true psychedelics like DMT and psilocybin, we pretty well figured out what the chemistry is. We're learning more and more all the time about what's going on in the brain when you take these things. Amanita just has not been studied to that level yet, and I think it's worthy to study it. There's a couple lifetimes' work there for somebody.
So I couldn't let a discussion about the Amanita mushroom pass without talking about Christmas. I wanted to know, given the understanding Dennis has of world religion and psychedelics, plus the fact he and Terrence grew up Catholic, does he celebrate Christmas?
Yeah, we do celebrate Christmas. I mean, we grew up Catholic, and we celebrated Christmas in the context of that, and it was very much the Christian, version of Christmas. But we still celebrate Christmas, but we've lost all that. We celebrate a strictly pagan Christmas, and we love Christmas, and but we celebrate it as a pagan solstice festival. It's like Saturnalia or something. It's a time for good friends, good food. The Yule log, the whole bit, that's how we celebrate Christmas. Christmas in the Christian version of it, I mean, the Christians co-opted Christmas. There are many gods in the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, or the ones that preceded that Jesus is modeled after. I mean, like Mithra, for example, and Osiris. I mean, their birthdays were the 25th of December, and they were gods who died and were resurrected. I mean, Jesus is clearly a sun god. He fits right into that mythical structure. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's great. That's part of our Western tradition. but I think Christianity is wrong to co-opt that and say, well, this is the real mystery, and totally ignoring these other things that it grew out of. So, so we celebrate Christmas, and we celebrate as pagans, and that's how we get around that, because the most fun things about Christmas are the pagan traditions. The Christmas tree is completely pagan. I mean, that goes way back to the Druids and beyond that, tree worship, plant worship, and shamanism, basically. Santa was a shaman.
Remember to visit bluehoney.org. Each of these episodes have a corresponding webpage with images and more details. Just go to bluehoney.org, follow the link to Blue Honey Radio, and there you will see this episode listed under the Lost Interviews. And while you're there, be sure to check out our new t-shirts on sale. All of the profits for everything sold on my website will be used to make this podcast better. So, as always, I want to thank everyone for showing your support. For updates and some random thoughts, be sure to follow me on Twitter at bluehoney_org. That's bluehoney_org. Be on the lookout for episode number 4 of the Lost Interviews. In this holiday edition, we explore the world of Christmas traditions and the Amanita muscaria mushroom with Dr. Patrick Harding. You've heard about this mushroom briefly in the past 2 episodes, and in episode number 4 it becomes the main subject. Until then, stay tuned, everybody.